Hi class, so now we're going to continue on with memory and the different areas of the brain that are involved in being able to encode as well as house store the memory that we have. The first thing is you know that we have neurons. Neurons are the important cells of the brain, and there are very specific circuits or sets of neurons that are important for memory. There are two very particular areas outside of what you see below with regards to brain structures. There's also something called the Broca's area. That's B-R-O-C-A, Broca's area, and another area called Wernicke's area, W-E-R-N-I-C-K-E-S, Wernicke's area. And these two areas are involved in the expression as well as the comprehension and production of language. And the reason that I mention these two areas, the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area, is because if somebody has brain damage later in their life, for example, from a heart attack or from a stroke, those areas are sometimes affected more often, in which case they might have difficulty speaking. They need to go into rehab or rehabilitation in order to get their language abilities back. And so those are two additional areas, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which are important for memory, and in particular memory that's lost later in life. It's not related to memory. It's not related to memory or language loss or anything like that from the moment of birth. It is important for that type of development and memory for things later on in development. So we have certain neurons which are specific for memory. We know that we have lots of neurotransmitters, so acetylcholine. Remember, acetylcholine, when we have low levels of acetylcholine, it is directly correlated to Alzheimer's, which is, of course, having great losses in memory. So certain neurotransmitters are going to play a big role in allowing memories to be created as well as allowing those memories to be retrieved. And we also have something called long-term potentiation, in which the simultaneous activations of certain neurons will strengthen the memory. It's kind of like instead of having just one single pathway for a memory to be made, there are multiple pathways. A basic example might be you go to a birthday party and you remember that it's a birthday party, but not only that, you remember that it's a birthday party and there were a lot of people that went there, and on top of that your favorite food was served. Perhaps it was in this really great restaurant that you always wanted to go to. So you have simultaneous pathways in your brain that are allowing your neurons to be activated so that it can create a much stronger memory in the long run. In a sense, you can remember these memories for much longer periods of time because they're more detail rich, and you have more things to fall back on in terms of trying to remember this particular event. There are also some very specific brain structures for explicit. Remember, explicit memory are memories that we can verbally talk about. They can be either autobiographical information, or they can be factual information that we learn, but we don't necessarily remember when we learned it. There's also implicit memory, which is based off of these conscious responses that we have, but we don't necessarily make those decisions or remember exactly where we learned those things as well. And they're typically memories for skills or skill sets that we have. So brushing your teeth would be considered an implicit memory because it is a procedure that you do after you get up in the morning. And it's not, yes, it has the element of you don't necessarily remember exactly when you learned it, but there's no real reinforcement for doing it, at least in that immediate moment. The brain structures that are important for explicit memory are the hippocampus. Remember, the hippocampus was very important for memory by itself, right? We had the hippo and the elephant. Elephants have really good memory, okay? Temporal lobe, which you remember, the temporal lobe is important for that auditory information, but also important for remembering things. And then, of course, the limbic system. And with regards to the limbic system, we talk about the amygdala. And if you think back to what the amygdala does, the amygdala was important for emotions and anger, right? So anger is an example of an emotion, but there's emotional content that's housed there, as well as spatial orientation and understanding where you are in relation to where other things are, okay? And then with regards to implicit memory, we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum was important for motor movements, right? Temporal lobe, again, for memory. And, of course, the hippocampus, which is also sort of the seat of where memory will come in and then eventually be disseminated to wherever it needs to go in the brain to be remembered, okay? So we have a number of very specific locations in which memory travels to or through, and we also have specific neurons that are taking that information into our brain. Here is just a basic diagram of where some of these brain structures are, okay, and where some of the different types of memory are located. So here you have a cerebellum, implicit memory, we have the hippocampus, explicit memory, and priming. Remember, priming is where we maybe say something to somebody, ask them a question in order to conjure up a memory. So we prime them. We kind of give them a little bit of a nudge in the right direction so that they'll know. Temporal lobe. We've already discussed the temporal lobe quite a bit. The amygdala, emotional memories, okay? And then, of course, the frontal lobes for episodic memory. So memory for very specific events in our life, autobiographical information, okay? But this is in your textbook, so you can go ahead and take a look in that for more details. Now, the last issue with memory, since we've already talked about memory as an encoding procedure, so how do we get the information into our brain? And then we talked about the different storage units within our brain. So, for example, sensory memory, sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, some of the different components that are involved in that. We also have to be able to retrieve that memory. Now, if we can't retrieve it and it's just stuck in our brain, then we're not going to be able to do anything with it. So it's very important that we have a retrieval mechanism in order to bring that information out. Now, one of the ways that we can do that is by looking at something called a serial position effect. Now, depending on how information is stored, some information is going to come out of your brain or come up in memory sooner than other things, okay? So if I asked you, for example, what did you do last week? You might be able to tell me fairly quickly what you did last week. But if I asked you, what did you do a month and a half ago? it might take you a little longer to retrieve that information. Okay, so the way that that memory is going to be stored may determine how quickly that memory is retrieved. Now, with the serial position effect, basically what it's saying is that we have a tendency to recall items or remember items at the beginning as well as at the end of lists. Okay? Now, it seems kind of odd that we would remember the beginning and the end, but it makes a lot of sense. If I give you a list of words, you'll typically remember the ones in the beginning and the ones at the end, because if I ask you to memorize them or try to remember as many as you can, you typically rehearse those first words. You might lose the ones in the middle, and then you will be able to say the last few words. Okay? So we have a tendency with regards to serial position, so the actual positioning of that particular item, we tend to remember the ones at the beginning as well as the end of the list. Okay? Now, I'm hoping that next time when I see you, we'll actually be able to run a little bit of an experiment so that we can look at this serial position effect. It's really quite interesting, and we can do our own little experiment in the classroom. Now, with serial position effect, we have something called primacy effect, and this is just being able to recall items at the beginning of the list, better recall for that, versus recency effect, where we tend to do better with the items at the end of the list. Now, some of you might do really well with items at the beginning, and then we lose the ones later on. Some of you might do really well with the more recent things and forget the stuff at the very beginning. So each individual has slightly different ways in which they remember things. But overall, when we're talking about a list of items, things that needed to be recalled over a period of time, we tend to remember the early things and we tend to remember the later things, but the things in the middle kind of get lost along the way. Okay? Now, with memory retrieval, there are two factors that can potentially help us in order to retrieve information better. The first being retrieval cues. So what kind of things can we use in the environment? What kind of things can we listen to what other people say to us? What kind of emotions are we feeling? Those can all be used as potential retrieval cues in the future, right? So if someone, again, asks you, what did you do this past weekend? And you think back, you remember the birthday party, and then you also remember the food that you ate, right? And you also remember all the people that were there. And you remember that the party went late into the night because it was a great party and everybody wanted to stay and have a really good time. Now, what you're doing is of course creating a memory much more rich because you have a lot of detail, but perhaps a lot of the reasons why you have that detail is because you're thinking about the different cues that you remember seeing, and you remember hearing, and you remember feeling, and so it makes the memory much more easier to retrieve. Okay, so those are retrieval cues. Now, on the other hand, maybe it doesn't have to do with the different things that are involved in that particular memory, but it has to do with how you are supposed to retrieve it, in which case this would be a retrieval task. So sometimes the way that I ask a question might bring back the memory much sooner than if I ask the question a different way. If I knew that you had a birthday party this past weekend that you went to, and I said, hey, how was the birthday party? And then you go ahead and you tell me everything about the birthday party, versus if I tell you, oh, what did you do this weekend? All right, you might not give me the same answer because the birthday party question is prompting you to think back to that specific event, whereas what did you do this weekend is just prompting a very general question. And so if I asked you that, you might be like, oh, no, we didn't really do that much. Okay, so the retrieval task, the way that the question is asked of the person, what kind of information we're trying to search for, That will depend on how and what kind of memory is retrieved. Okay, so we have retrieval cues, which are within the environment in order to help us to bring back the memory of something before. And then we have retrieval tasks, the way that someone asks you a question in order to retrieve the information from before. If they ask it a particular way, you'll retrieve different information. Now there's a number of different types of retrieval. The two that we like to talk about the most are called recall, where it's a memory task in order to retrieve previously learned information. And most of the time, that's the type of memory retrieval that you are using whenever you take tests or whenever someone asks you a question. Okay, you've learned this material before, and now someone asks you, so can you tell me what some of the neurotransmitters are in the brain? Or, oh, hey, can you tell me what operant conditioning is? Can you tell me what deferred imitation is? Now, of course, these are some things that we still have to study and make sure that we understand, but we would be using recall in order to retrieve that information. Okay, so we've learned it before, and now we're going to try and recall or remember what it is that we have previously learned. Okay, so that is so totally all on you in order to bring back the memory of what it is that you have learned. Now, on the other hand, we have something called recognition. And this is a memory task in order to identify or recognize learned items. So in this sense, instead of, when we take our tests and everything, I'm usually asking you to recall some previously learned information. That would be a traditional test or a testing process. With recognition, perhaps I put a diagram up on the board. Perhaps I put a picture on the board. I put a picture of the brain on the board. Okay? And I'm going to ask you to identify what these different parts of the brain are. Okay? So in that sense, you're using recognition because you're using your memory, or this is a memory task in order to identify or recognize something that you've learned. So instead of making you do all the work to remember something without giving you any information, now I give you it's like giving you some clues and seeing whether or not those clues allow you to remember exactly what it is that you had learned before. Okay? So if you think about it, recall is test taking, recognition is you see something and you have to try to remember what it is that you are looking at. Okay? So we have recall and we have recognition. All right. So with retrieval, occasionally we have moments in time when we remember certain things, and sometimes there are things that we don't expect to remember right then and there. It's like a light bulb goes off and you're like, oh wait, I remember. Or you're thinking about something and then you forget about it, and then all of a sudden the memory comes back. One of those types of memory retrieval is called a flashbulb memory. Flashbulb memories are typically memories of emotionally significant events, and they often require very vivid imagery. So a flashbulb memory might be maybe you remember the 9/11 tragedy, okay? And you had been home that day and you watched it on TV. Or you were at school and you watched it on TV. Now that is a very emotionally significant event because it affected millions of people. And you might have a vivid imagery of it because you can actually you remember seeing what it was like when those towers were hit and when it started crumbling down. Okay? Maybe you have a flashbulb memory for this past election. You've been watching it on TV. It's a very emotionally charged event because people are, vying for each candidate, and we don't know which way it's going to go. It's such a tight race. And you were watching things on TV. Maybe you have vivid imagery of going to the polls for the first time. So that is going to be what we call a flashbulb memory, because in the future, someone might say like, oh, do you remember the election of 2012? Bam, the light bulb goes on and you can totally remember what it was like to go to the polls. You remember the emotion behind it. And so you have a very rich memory for that particular event. Now, we of course also have memories for traumatic events. I guess the 9/11 scenario would go along with a memory for a traumatic event. But the thing about traumatic events is that even though we have memories for them, they could be flashbulb memories. Even though we have memories for them, the memories aren't always completely accurate. Perhaps after the event has occurred, somebody asks us questions like, oh, what did the person look like? How tall were they? Did they wear a hat? What color was their shirt? And then we start, our memory starts potentially failing on us a little bit. Not because we don't have a good memory, but because we are so bombarded with all these other things that sometimes those other things get into the mix of this traumatic event. So it's sometimes very difficult, and we'll talk about eyewitness testimony in a second, but sometimes it's very difficult to know whether or not something actually happened. And that's why, with regards to eyewitness testimony, it's not always the most accurate, because again, memories can get distorted. Maybe we think, hey, yeah, the person that was really tall, and then somebody else is like, no, they weren't that tall. They were actually kind of short. So those kind of inaccuracies or distortions are very much laden within the retrieval of memory for traumatic events. We also have repressed memories. Now, these are memories that we obviously can't remember unless we have some sort of mechanism, for example, hypnosis or something like that, in order to bring these memories back out. Typically, repressed memories are extremely traumatic events that have happened to the person, and they essentially bury the memory altogether and pretend that that this memory never happened in the first place. So this is a defense mechanism by which that person will forget and continue to forget that memory. Now, of course, it doesn't mean we can't figure out ways to cut it out, because sometimes these repressed memories can be shown in other ways. For example, someone who may have had abuse issues when they were a child, perhaps as they're getting older, they realize that they seem to be having difficulty in relationships, and they don't know why. So then they go to a therapist. The therapist says, well, let's talk about your childhood. You start talking about your childhood, and perhaps the memory of the trauma or the abuse will come out, because the brain is being allowed to actually think about what went on during childhood. Now, they might not realize that they have a repressed memory, but eventually that memory will seep its way out, so that in the hopes, of course, that person will get better and be able to learn how to deal with it in a much more productive way. Okay? Now, I mentioned before that we would talk about eyewitness testimony a little bit. And with regards to eyewitness testimony, just like the way that we look at the memory for traumatic events, sometimes it may contain errors. Okay? Typically, again, eyewitness testimony and this type of memory is for some kind of emotional event. You see someone get robbed, you get into a car accident, you see a car accident, whatever it might be, and you were a witness to it, and now the police come over and they want to find out what happened. Okay? Now, the problem is that we don't always know exactly what happened, and we don't always remember things exactly the way that they happened. Okay? With eyewitness testimony, they have to, lawyers and doctors and psychiatrists or psychologists, they have to pay very close attention to distortions. So maybe the reason things are distorted is because that individual is having problems with somebody else. And so then they attribute some of that person's physical characteristics to the person that actually committed the crime, right? There's a distortion. Maybe there's a bias. Maybe that person was robbed earlier by a person of a certain ethnic group. And then they see this event happening in front of them. And so they attribute that previous experience to this experience. So they have a bias towards who the actual perpetrator is. Okay? Or perhaps we just have plain inaccuracies. Was the person wearing a hat? Yes, they were wearing a hat. When in actuality, they weren't wearing a hat at all. Maybe they were wearing a hoodie. Okay? Was the person wearing sunglasses? Yes, they were wearing sunglasses. Actually, no, they weren't wearing any glasses at all. Okay? So we really need to be careful, especially when it comes to asking other people about what they witnessed, because they're not always going to know exactly what happened. And perhaps if, just like if when we were talking about naturalistic observation, if a person knows that they're being asked these questions and they kind of have an idea of where you want the answer to go, it is very possible that they will move their answer in that direction in order to appease you, make you feel better. They'll possibly do it in order to make themselves feel better, so that no one will come back and ask them the same questions again. If they agree with you, then you know the same answers that they do. So it makes it a little less stressful. So we really need to watch these things when it comes to eyewitness testimony. It may contain errors. It is typically memory for an emotional event, but we need to focus on the possibility of distortion, bias, as well as inaccuracies in the testimony. Now, with regards to retrieval, sometimes we don't always retrieve what it is that we want. And sometimes it has to do with the fact that the information that went into our head, we didn't really pay as close attention to it. And so that's why sometimes we get things wrong, because the information that came in is not exactly the correct information. So when we try to retrieve it, we forget a lot of details. So here's just a little experiment that's been done before, but there are 15 pennies on the screen right now. Which of these pennies is a true penny? Which of these actually looks like what a penny looks like? Right? Now, when you look at these, you look and you're like, well, they all look very similar to each other. There are slight differences in them. I don't actually know. But certainly you know what a penny looks like. You know it's the little copper coin as opposed to the nickel or the dime or the quarter. So you know what a penny looks like. But do you really know what a penny looks like is the question. Now, which of these is it? Which of these pennies would it be? All right. Now I can tell you that the correct one is this one, right? So you can go ahead, you can take a penny out, compare it, and you'll see that this is the actual penny and what the actual penny looks like. But all these other ones, they don't really have too much difference between them. Little things here and there, In God We Trust versus United States of America. Where is the date and liberty? Are they on the right sides? Oh, maybe Lincoln is supposed to face the other way. Okay. So it's interesting because sometimes we do know what something is because we've encoded it, but we haven't necessarily encoded for all of the minute details. So we know just enough to get us by, but we don't necessarily know enough in order to have a complete memory retrieval that is accurate. Okay? Now, another reason why things don't always get retrieved and we forget some of the information is through what's called interference. And this is when we forget because other information gets in the way. Right? If you're trying to learn a whole bunch of things all at the same time, sometimes other information stops you from being able to remember the previous information or the information that's going to come later. Okay? There are two types of interferences we can have. We could have proactive interference, okay, where the material learned earlier disrupts retrieval of material that is learned later. Okay? So essentially what happens is maybe I teach you something. I teach you a certain way in order to easily remember a list of words. So this is the best method to take. You should always do this. I guarantee that you will learn all 20 of these words and you won't have any problems. And then I give you a second list of words. And I say, oh, but this list of words, you should remember it this other way. You need to apply a different method to it. And so I give you the second list of words and you're having some problems because you kind of want to revert back to the first way you did something, but you're like, no, she told me something else and I have to learn it this other way. Okay? That's proactive interference. The material that you learned earlier disrupts the material that you're learning later. Okay? Now we have the opposite with retroactive interference, where the material that we learn later disrupts the retrieval of the material learned earlier. Okay? So we learn something, we know how to do it, we learn something else, and then we find that I can't really remember what it was that I learned the first time around. Well, it's because there's some retroactive interference there. There's some disruption in that previously learned material, and so it's much more difficult to retrieve what it was that you originally learned. Okay? So you can have interference both sides. You can either have the early stuff interfering with what you learn later, or you can have the later stuff be so prominent that you don't even really remember what you learned before. Okay? This is just an example or a pictorial example for proactive and retroactive interference. Here you see proactive interference. You have to study for a biology test, okay? And you're studying for a psychology test, but you take your psychology test first, right? The only thing is that while you're studying your bio test, it kind of interferes with some of the stuff that you learned that you were studying for in psychology. And so when you take the test, perhaps you don't do as well. Okay? You don't do as well because you're still thinking about the stuff that you did in bio. The second way is, of course, retroactive. You study for your psych test first, and then you study for your bio test. But then you have to take your psych test first, and so the stuff that you learned in your that you were studying for bio interferes or blocks, and you're like, oh, I don't remember what the name of that thing is that I learned in psychology. And the reason for that is because, well, you studied your bio test later, and so it kind of interfered once it comes time to take the actual test. Okay, so definitely make sure that you know the difference between proactive and retroactive interference, because that will potentially allow you to, understand the way that we can retain information and hopefully not forget it as easily. Okay, and one of the last things that we'll talk about is amnesia. Amnesia is the loss of memory. There are two different kinds of amnesia. I'm actually not going to test you as much on amnesia, but the two types of loss are the anterograde and the retrograde. Anterograde amnesia is a memory disorder that affects the retention for new information and events. So it's kind of like you are going about your business and someone's saying, oh, I want to teach you something. This is really great. I hope you understand it. It's wonderful. You go off and then you forget everything that they just taught you because you're having issues with retaining that information. Now, on the other hand, you're able to remember things from far back. Okay, so anterograde amnesia is really talking about how you retain and understand new information and whether or not you're able to even do that at all. Retrograde amnesia is memory loss for a segment of the past. So in other words, you just remember bits and pieces of the past, but but your new events that happen are perfectly fine. Okay, someone who is probably suffering from Alzheimer's is more likely to fall under the anterograde amnesia. They have great memory for the past events, but then they have some difficulty in learning new things or remembering new things. Retrograde amnesia is just you remember certain past events, but not all of them. It's kind of like, I don't really remember what I did back then, but I know I did something. But when it comes to new events, you don't have any problems with it. Okay? And what do we do in terms of applying memory tips, especially to your studies? Well, you want to stay organized. If we stay organized, then we'd be able to encode that information pretty well. Once that information is in our brain, we can rehearse it. And that's mainly using the short-term memory where we rehearse information over and over and over and over and over again until it can finally move into long-term memory store. And then lastly, we need to be able to retrieve that information, whether we retrieve it based off of retrieval cues or a very specific retrieval task that we use. Whatever it might be, we need to figure out a way of how to retrieve that information out of long-term memory into short-term memory so that we can use it for that particular time. Okay? And to our life, we can think about our autobiographical information, continue to think back to when we were younger. What kind of things did we do? What kind of things happened when we were this age? What was it like to go to school for the first time? What was it like when your sibling was born? What was it like when you first saw grandma, went to Disney World? Whatever that might be. We can constantly go back and try and remember those events. And sometimes that will help to improve our memory in the long run. And of course, generating different life stories. Creating and understanding that your life is full of memories and we can constantly generate them by talking about them to other people, talking about true events that have happened as opposed to making up stories, and then sometimes those stories become real life and then we don't know the difference between the factual information and the sort of imaginary information. Okay, so these are some different tips that we can use in order to apply memory and hopefully be able to improve our memory in the long run. Okay, so that's the end of our slides for today.